Well, good evening, everybody, and thank you for joining us again tonight. So, this is the fourth interview that we've done, and for the upcoming federal election. And again, just to remind people why we're doing this. So, obviously, I'm getting ahead of myself here on the tech. Sorry about that. But just to remind people why we're doing this, we set out with a view to try to interview candidates to talk about issues that are affecting St. John. And many would remember the city of St. John put out a position paper asking candidates to consider certain pieces of the puzzle, if you will, of how the federal government relates to the municipal government, what we're hoping for outcomes from the next federal government, and how we want that to affect our community. So this really was kind of an undertaking that I did personally. Again, this as I said before, this is not something I'm doing on behalf of City Council. I am obviously wearing my councilor's hat, but not something that I'm doing on behalf of City Council. But we want to make sure that you, the voters, have an opportunity to see how things interact between federal, municipal, provincial governments, because that's ambiguous at the best of times. And when it comes to voting and marking your checkbox, however you mark that, my hope is that you'll be able to do that in an informed way, and in a way ultimately that is in line with your values, whatever those values are. And it's hard to do that when you don't understand the other candidates and you don't understand what their values are, and you haven't had an opportunity to hear them speak more in depth about issues and have an opportunity to see how they have mastery over some subjects and what their strengths will be as a candidate. It's easy to get wrapped in partisan politics, but at the end of the day, whoever we send to Ottawa is going to be the one carrying our voice and fighting for what we believe we need. So it's important who we send. All right. So without any further ado, obviously you'll remember we've introduced the Liberal candidate Wayne Long, or we've interviewed him, sorry. We've interviewed the NDP candidate Don Paulin. We've interviewed the People's Party candidate Nick Pereira. And tonight we're going to interview the Green Party of Canada candidate Anne McAllister. And here she is. Hi, Anne.
Hi, Brent.
How are you doing tonight?
Just fine, thank you. And thank you for this opportunity.
Yeah, no, my pleasure. So just right off the top, this is not your first time running.
No, this is my second time running federally, and I have run provincially 4 times.
And so how are you doing? This is anytime I've run twice, and it's a big undertaking, and you're now 3.5 weeks into this campaign. So how's the energy level? How are you doing right now?
Well, I'm very lucky. I've got a very energetic and supportive campaign team, and just wonderful volunteers. So I find that is energizing. Mind you, this is a very tight timeline. It's a very short election period, and so it really is go to the finish line.
I think this is actually one of the shortest campaigns there's ever been, to my knowledge. I can't say that I've looked that up, but I was listening to Peter Mansbridge's podcast today, The Bridge, and he and Bruce Anderson were referencing that. Neither one of them could remember a shorter campaign. So that must present a lot of challenges.
It does. It really does. And on top of that, I did enter the campaign about 1 week late. I did enter 1 week late. So knock off a week from that already very short 31-day period. And you can see it's intense.
Wow. Great. Well, best of luck, obviously. And tonight, again, we just want to try to talk through some of the issues. And obviously, I've sent some questions ahead of time to you, and we'll ask some questions off the side of that. And just for viewers at home, if you have questions, feel free. I can see any questions that are coming. I can't necessarily see questions that are coming through Twitter unless you click the Periscope view. So if you're watching in Twitter and it's in the small screen, just click the link or click the box, and it should bring up the full view, and it will bring up a bit of a different chat box. Then I can see your comments. I will try to shoot back to Twitter to make sure I'm not missing anything, but I might miss you because it doesn't come to my chat box. For those of you on Facebook or YouTube, I can see your comments coming in on the back end here, and we'll try to get to those as well. We've got a list of questions. Obviously, they're more focused on the ballot box questions. And so the first question off the top, just to give people a chance to hear from you, is, why did you feel it was necessary to run, in your case again, but why did you feel it necessary to run, and why at the federal level?
Well, I wanted to bring the green values and the green policies and make people, bring them forward and make people aware of them, because I believe that the Green Party has tremendous policies and values to offer, and that people should be aware of what they are so that they can compare them with the other parties. So that was my main motivation. It was just, I believe in the Green Party. I believe in its values. I believe in what it is trying to accomplish, and I wanted to bring that forward so that people would know about it.
And so what do you think the values of the Green Party are? What do you see as being those main pieces of their values?
Well, to me, the main pieces of their values reveal themselves in three major priorities, and that is to take real and meaningful action on the climate crisis, to help to close or complete the social safety network, so that people can live in security and can thrive and not fall into destitution. And this has become particularly critical because of the pandemic. And I believe that having a complete social safety support for people is crucial to our recovery from COVID-19. And I believe it's crucial to climate action. And also, I'm passionate about electoral reform. I feel that the current first past the post system is broken. We can have majority governments at the federal level with only a 39% majority, 39% of the popular vote. Well, what about the other 61%? So I would like to see electoral reform towards some kind of made in Canada proportional representation system. So those are my three priorities that I see really express the green values at this time.
That's great. And when it comes to those, we've been promised participatory democracy and we've been promised electoral reform before. And I know this wasn't one of the questions, but why do you think that hasn't happened? What do you think is missing in that conversation that you would hope to bring if you were our member of parliament?
Well, I think two things happened recently. Justin Trudeau promised over 1,600 times that 2015 would be the last election under first past the post. And then the committee that was struck to explore electoral reform and to recommend a system that would be suitable to Canada actually came up with some very good recommendations, such as mixed member proportional and rural urban proportional. But they didn't recommend the system that Justin Trudeau favored. So that was the end of it. Then another factor that happened was in British Columbia, they had a very good citizens assembly that did an in-depth study on electoral reform and made a recommendation for a system that they felt would work in BC. But then the question, when it came to the referendum, the question was really badly done and the whole referendum badly conducted. So that effectively killed it.
Yeah.
So I think those two things, the fact that, you have a leader that doesn't like what the committee comes up with, so puts the kibosh on it, or you have excellent work on one side of it, like the Citizens Assembly, but then the referendum itself is poorly handled.
Yeah, it's one of those things where, it's funny because I do listen to a few podcasts, and I have always been a staunch supporter of more proportional representation. And I know that there's a few interesting models that were explored out in BC, but like you said, when all all that energy was expended on the topic in BC, largely people said they were just confused and they didn't really know how to cast their ballot. And it just led them to a place where they said, well, you know what, we'll just have to pick the status quo. But so many politicians will point to that and say, see, no one really wants it. But, Peter Mansbridge and Bruce Anderson were on their podcast the other day saying, do we really want proportional representation? Like, look at Israel and how many times they've had an election in the past 2 years. They've had 4 elections, and but again, it comes back to that. Yes, but that's their system. That's the one they chose, and it comes with some of those limitations. And obviously, it kind of gets drowned out. But no, that's interesting. I know that's always been on the Green Party platform. And I believe it is, again, proportional representation. Does the Green Party have any sort of specific system that they're putting forward, or are they just asking for more proportional representation?
They are asking for proportional representation. They are suggesting, but they are saying that the system should be chosen, and the Citizens Assembly should use the work of the previous committee, which apparently is very, very good, to base, as a starting point. In other words, we don't need to go back to square one.
Right.
And then they can revisit the work and refresh their work, and from that, make a recommendation.
Gotcha. Okay. Well, we're off to the races here already. So, we've obviously got some unique issues here in St. John. And, I hear what you're saying. Proportional representation is going to help people feel like their vote can be realized. But what if you were to pick something significant? What do you think that this region, so St. John Rothesay, I guess we'll say riding, what do you think this riding needs from its next federal representative in Ottawa?
Well, I think it needs someone that will advocate for people living in poverty and people with disabilities and vulnerable populations. As we know, St. John has an extremely high poverty rate and high child poverty rate. Rothesay not so much, but there are people living in poverty in Rothesay. I remember in a previous campaign visiting a young woman who had a physical disability and who was literally trapped in a basement apartment on $574 a month of her welfare check, trying to eke out a little bit of money knitting sweaters, and just trapped, cut off from the community, cut off from opportunity. She was a bright, intelligent person, but she was trapped. And so I think that to end this terrible cycle and this loss of potential is that we need a guaranteed livable income. We need an immediate moratorium on evictions for rent arrears and renovation during the pandemic and after the pandemic. We need a rental arrears assistance program that is retroactive, that will help people come to grips with their rental arrears. And we need national standards for rent controls and vacancy controls. Now, the city and the town, I believe they both need direct federal funding, where the province does not, which does not go through the province, but to which the province still contributes. I think direct federal funding and increased federal funding would be transformative. Now, that said, I think that St. John in particular, being an industrial city, needs to face the fact that it has, for instance, allowed water rates to be just unconscionably low for industrial users. And I personally would work to return Spruce Lake to the West Side residents, to return that as a water source, and change the federal legislation that prevents the mill, for example, the pulp mill, from accessing other sources of water. This needs study. I don't even know how sustainable it would be for them to extract directly from the river. But if it were studied and it were sustainable, then I am all in favor of taking the mill off Spruce Lake and returning it to the people of the West Side, and charging the industrial users a fair water rate, which I don't believe they're paying right now.
Yeah, it's interesting. Since coming on council, I've been trying to familiarize myself with that file. It's heated because there's lots of people who have had some serious situations happen, cost them lots of money, and it was because the city undertook a new agreement that didn't work out. And of course, there's a lawsuit pending. In my role as a councillor, because of this lawsuit, I'm actually barred legally from commenting on it. But what I can say is one thing I didn't know is that although you're right, industrial users pay a lot less. One thing that they are taking is they're not taking drinkable water. So it isn't, that is one difference that a lot of people will leave out. And I'm not suggesting that it's a fair rate, even because of that. But it is something it's a bit of a nuance, right? Is when we send water to the mill on the west side, that water isn't drinkable. When we send water to the house beside it, that water is drinkable. It's tested twice a week, or whatever the testing regimen is, once a week. I can't remember. But anyway, those rates are what they are because for years our council has believed that unless we give these breaks to industry, that they're going to leave. And so what I hear you saying is that we need a federal representative that is going to push back against that narrative, that is going to challenge that narrative and say, look, people have to pay their fair share. And so does that come because, as you know, municipalities set the water rate. How do you see the federal government engaging with the municipality on that front to achieve that outcome?
Well, I see the federal government, it's federal legislation that, for example, does not allow the mill to extract raw water from the river. So I see a role for the federal government in exploring that legislation and seeing if that legislation needs to stand or if it can be changed.
Right.
And I haven't seen any movement on that or any effort to do that. So if the city had another option or the mill had another option, then, possibilities would open up to returning Spruce Lake for residential use that, perhaps people didn't see before.
Yeah, no, actually, that's interesting to me. I didn't realize there was an environmental piece there that the federal government was in charge of. Yes, I knew that there was provincial regulations around it, but it makes sense when you say that because and again, this is where it can get confusing to people, is the municipality sets that rate and we provide the pipes and we provide the filtration for the water, but then the provincial government is what imposes certain regulations on, okay, what are the standards, and then the federal government has its own assessments and standards, and it's a good point. If you change one of those, you definitely give yourself an opportunity for a different outcome. But it's a good point, right? So I hear you saying, if you're in as a candidate, if you become the member of parliament, that this is an angle that you're going to push for, is these kind of reimagining of the status quo around things like water rates. But is there more to it than that? Do you think there's anything else that we need in St. John Rothsay from our next candidate?
Well, before I leave the water thing, I was just wondering if the Green Party would like to make cities charter cities. Any city that wants to be a charter city can be a charter city. And I'm wondering, I don't know enough about this, but it raised the question in my mind, if St. John were a charter city again, would it be able to have a direct relationship with the federal government that it doesn't enjoy now, that might open up a lot more possibilities to, for instance, finding alternative water sources for an industrial user?
Yeah, that's a big question, right? Because St. John predates the province of New Brunswick, and when everything was transferred from the Crown to the new nation of Canada, it got tricky. And what I understand about the charter is that because so much has been regulated to the provinces, and because provinces are the ones that actually provide any framework for the existence of a city or a municipality, that charter, it's like you'd almost have to go to the Supreme Court and challenge a number of issues and get a ruling in order for anything to happen. It's not that it's not possible, though. It's just that there's a big, because the federal government doesn't want to step on the province's toes, and the province is the one that says this is what a municipality is, even though St. John has a charter with the federal government and the Crown. No one wants to enforce it. It is very unique, but it is interesting, and I've had some pretty interesting conversations with people about what that could mean. So anyway, it's a good point, right? If you have a federal candidate who's not afraid to bring that up and push that envelope and fact find, you have the chance to get a different outcome. So it's great. That's definitely something that no one else has talked about on our stuff, but is one of those unique pieces. All right, we'll jump here to the next one. So, you took a peek at the position paper of the city.
Yes.
What do you think's the most achievable thing in there? It's got a lot of stuff. To the city's defense, they didn't want to leave anything out. Some of council suggested, look, maybe it's a little big. It's hard for anybody to digest a big thing like that and to actually get anything done because there's so much in it. So you ask for everything and you end up getting nothing. If you asked for one thing, you might get it. It's the thinking. And that was certainly my way of thinking, is like, what are we going to ask for here specifically? So there's a lot in it, but what would you say in that position paper is achievable with a Green member of Parliament?
Well, it's interesting because when I read the position paper, I read it as a single ask. They were asking for direct federal funding. And I read the 5 funding issues and the 5 social issues as really areas where that funding could be put to use. So looking at those 10 sort of areas where that funding could be put to use, I see the affordable housing as probably the most attainable, immediately attainable right now, because number one, it's on everybody's radar. Number two, it is affecting so many people, and it is a national, it's not just St. John, it is a national crisis. And the existing government already has the rapid housing initiative in place, which the Green Party in its platform said it would expand on and roll out more builds faster. So, I mean, you've already got an awareness level, you've got governments taking notice, and you've got already a program in place. So I think a lot more could be done, but you've got a real start there that I think you might not have with some of the other things.
Well, it's a good point, and I'm just going to show this comment that we got from Facebook. Sierra Stewart, she said, being in low-income single mom, rent will be $875 on the 1st of December. Housing is full, and so New Brunswick housing, and can't help me. This is a hot button. I would say, if St. John had one issue, it would be housing. Mm-hmm. And when we're making national attention and media is coming here to interview single mothers like Sierra who have had their rent doubled. Now, I'm not saying Sierra's had her rent doubled, but Rebecca Train was interviewed by CTV and CBC and everybody. She was on the radio talking about her rent going from $800 and whatever to $1,600 and whatever, and it's ludicrous. But you look at how does that happen? Well, the province is the one that dictates housing policy, but the federal government has been the one to step in over the past decade for sure, and in the past differently, to say, yeah, but the federal government has a part to play in ensuring Canadians have homes. So when you say the Green Party wants to expand on housing, and I know that this really goes well into our next question. You know, the original question being, um, you know, what's the most achievable win in what we asked for in that position paper from the city of St. John. You said affordable housing. The Green Party is the only party that I've seen so far with a platform topic to talk about a just transition. So I wonder if you can comment on, and by that, like a just transition for workers who are working in oil and gas,
Right.
and moving those and putting supports in place to help them transition. And I see that tying into housing, because if they're going to go to work somewhere, where does it make sense for them to work? In housing. So is there any piece to that you've heard from the Green Party, or you've picked up on their platform, that you would want to push for specifically around housing? You mentioned expanding the rapid housing initiative, but is there anything in there that you say, like, this is one thing that I believe we can really do that will make a difference to how many affordable units we have in St. John?
Okay. Well, I think that federal funding allocated to social, supportive, and affordable housing can be transformative, because it will create local jobs. And, it will, if you think of workers transitioning from, who are in the trades, transitioning from, let's say, the fossil fuel sector, from oil and gas, then, you can see that perhaps their skills could be, with, maybe just some retraining, could be deployed in this sector.
Mm-hmm.
But I think that it puts a lot of tradespeople to work.
Yep.
And not just construction, but also restoration and renovation, because the Green Party wants to restore and renovate existing housing to the highest energy efficiency standards, and make it available for nonprofit, affordable, non-market housing, social and supportive housing. I mean, that will keep people working here, money
Yep.
circulating within the community here, taxes paid from here, which in turn, in other words, it's like a positive feedback loop. It's money that is circulating within the community, from which the community is benefiting.
Yeah, it's exactly as you say. It's the definition of community wealth building, and man, it's when you think about that potential. And so I'm glad to see that the Greens have that renovation and restoration piece in that platform, because there's 42 abandoned buildings right now in this city, and 3 of them are up for sale to developers. But what's lacking is that quarterback, that person who's back to say, okay, do you know about this funding stream? Do you know about this funding stream? And having that multiple streams of funding to support a type of renovation, and a company that wants to say, look, like, yes, this building is in rough shape, but it's not worth tearing down. How do we restore it? We protect the investment we already have in that building, especially from a greenhouse gas perspective. We've already cut down the wood, we've already poured the concrete, we've already done some of this work. So why would we do it all over again? It is interesting. I know the NDP also talk about restoration and renovation. Around social housing, have you picked up anything? Like, how do we get nonprofits, more nonprofits started? Because in St. John, we only have a couple that are doing housing. And when it comes to funding for nonprofits, it usually comes from the federal government. So what do you think the role there is for our next member of parliament around there, like trying to find new nonprofits who can go out and build those social housing assets?
I think it's exactly what you said, both to search for, put out invitations to people who are perhaps have experience in related sectors to consider getting involved in the nonprofit sector.
Right.
Since the Green Party has dedicated funding to affordable housing and social housing, then it becomes more realistic. In other words, it's not issuing an invitation but not backing it with any resources.
Right.
So I think that those two things working together can do a lot. Also, the Green Party is very interested in urban indigenous housing. And I think that, and wants to provide incentives to providers, people who are prepared to provide that kind of housing. And that immediately what comes to mind are builders, renovators, people in restoration. Since the Green Party, a Green government would have a dedicated funding stream for that and incentives for that, that becomes very attractive to people in the building industry who perhaps are looking for opportunities.
No, it's good. It's a great point. If you say you want to do something but you don't resource it, it doesn't get done.
Exactly.
And so this is one thing that's missing from the conservative platform. It's missing from the liberal platform. They say they want to build a lot of buildings, and I'll give the conservatives credit. They've talked specifically about purpose-built rental units,
Right.
and taking foreign buyers out of the market. But at the end of the day, if we leave it up to the free market, there's no guarantees that we can control the outcome of affordability. If we give it to the nonprofit sector, it's a lot more likely that we'll get that outcome. So
Yes.
that's my opinion. But I am glad to see the Greens that have that. I know that the NDP have a similar position, although it's not as specific as that. It has to do with 500,000 units in the nonprofit sector for affordable housing. So, but anyway, it's a great point. There's a lot of people asking that question in St. John, and I think it is probably the question for at least St. John. I can't speak about Rothsay, but all right.
It is in Rothsay, believe it or not, because
Really?
I've talked to seniors who say, I would like to downsize and I would like to sell my house and go into an apartment or a condominium. But there is, number one, there's almost nothing available. In an affordable apartment, there is literally nothing available.
Right.
And the condominiums are twice the price that the senior would get for selling their 3-bedroom bungalow. So they're trapped.
Right. No, that's a good point. That's interesting. I didn't know that.
Yeah, I've heard that again and again and again.
Okay. Well, all right. Let's just up to the next question here. I think that one was, we had a good little chat on that. All right. So that answers the question of housing too. I mean, we hit 5 and 6 there. So let's get down to healthcare. Right now, my family doesn't have a family doctor. We've been here since 2015. I'm from here, obviously. I moved away. I lived in Toronto, lived in Hamilton, and wherever I went, I had a doctor within about 6 months. And some of it was personal relationships with people who were like, oh yeah, you should call my doctor. But I was able to get in Ontario when I was there. And I have friends in Alberta, and they don't seem to complain about these crazy 2-year wait lists for a family doctor. We've been here since 2016, and we had a family doctor by 2018. We lost him because he was actually fired from Horizon Health for various reasons that we hear in 2019. And now we're back on the wait list and don't have a family doctor. We got 3 kids. This is a major problem. And obviously Blaine Higgs, the provincial government, has come out and said, we're going to fix this in 2 weeks. And I think they've said by the end of September, we're going to come at you with a plan, and we're going to give you some high-level goals that we're setting out to accomplish and how we're going to do that. I would say we've heard some of that before. What do you think is missing around that topic of healthcare, and what is the Green Party saying about that topic?
Okay. One thing I think is missing is talking about transfer payments, which come from the federal government to the provinces. Right now, our transfer payments are based on GDP. That was put in place by Stephen Harper. As a Green member of Parliament, I would fight for health transfers that are based on demographics. In other words, New Brunswick has a higher proportion of seniors than any other province in Canada. And seniors are heavier users of the healthcare system. It just comes with the territory. So given that, that to me would argue for increasing the health transfers. The other factor is basing it on real health needs, not the GDP, the real health needs of the people. That should be what determines health, the amount of the health transfer. And so I would, as a Green MP, absolutely advocate for basing health transfers on those two factors, and that New Brunswick deserves an increase. They need it.
Right. So, Blaine, to his credit, he said it doesn't just come down to money. I shouldn't say just to his credit, but that's what he said. It's not just about money. So around healthcare, when we talk about doctors, when we talk about nurses, and we talk about some of these external forces that we can't always control. And okay, so you say transfers. So what I'm hearing there is that, New Brunswick, you're going to be a candidate or a member of Parliament that's going to push for a different set of criteria around who gets what and how much money. But do you think there's anything, I guess I would push back a little bit and say, how is the federal government going to guarantee that doctors and nurses are allocated to New Brunswick? It's a tricky question, and I know that some of that is okay. Well, and we've heard it from our nurses who said, "Well, look, we could go to Alberta and make $7 more an hour," and our premier looked at them and said, "Well, you should go to Alberta then." I don't agree with that. That's his position. He believes that there's a reason for them to stay and whatnot. Fine, but how is there anything in there about that? Because if we just spend more money, there's no guarantees we can still attract those doctors and those nurses. So is there any piece to the puzzle there that you would comment on?
Well, I really think that the federal government should work collaboratively more with the provinces. And as you've mentioned before, it's a very tricky minefield because provinces administer health care.
Right.
The federal government funds it. However, the federal government also sets priorities for health care. And I believe one priority that the federal government should set is the priority that the provinces look at moving away from the doctor or the physician care provider as a small business and look towards them as being part of a community health center. And so how a community health center would work is that you would have a number of physicians together in a clinic. They would have nurses. They would have maybe some physician assistants. Maybe there's a midwife there, a dietitian, an addictions and mental health counselor. In other words, it's like one-stop shopping for a community. It's the healthcare center of a community, like a set of neighborhoods in a geographical area. That has the advantage with the healthcare shortage, or with the doctor shortage, of if you go to your clinic, you might not be able to get an appointment with your specific doctor, but there's a good chance that another doctor can fit you in. And they would share the files and share the patient information. They would conference about the patient. It would be more like team health care. And I see that as a way of making the more a broader use of scarce resources.
That's Interesting. And I can see the tie in there because if the federal government gives those incentives to community health units, we'll call them, or I forget, sorry, what did you call them?
I
Community
call them community healthcare centers.
healthcare centers. Thank you. So that wraparound idea, especially around midwifery. So I happen to be married to a staunch midwife advocate. She has been, we've had all three of our children at home, and we were set before we come to New Brunswick to have a midwife do that. And I did some digging, and it doesn't matter where I went. It was the United Kingdom, it was Estonia, it was the United States. The return on investment for having midwives who can attend low-risk births outside the hospital is $4 to $1 of investment. So
wow,
it's a ridiculous return on investment. And so I can imagine if we layered that on social workers, if we laid that on a pediatrician and a dietitian, like you say, we start to multiply that. And so it's an interesting idea. Do you think that comes in the way of the federal government incentivizing it to say, okay, New Brunswick, you're going to treat it like this? Well, we're going to give doctors who want to set up these clinics X amount of dollars. Or what does that look like? How do we roll that out in practice?
well, I think one way could be to, and now I'm sort of riffing here because I don't know how health transfers work.
Right.
But I could I think I have heard of cases where certain amounts of money have been earmarked for specific purposes.
Yeah, they call it strings attached.
Yes.
Yeah.
So I could see that would be a case where strings would be attached
Right.
to incentivize that.
Yeah, no, it makes sense.
Yeah.
And that certainly makes sense. And we almost need that in New Brunswick to get our government to do some of those more, I guess, progressive things, which are common in other provinces. Even in Nova Scotia, there's the existence of, similar to what you say, these clinics that have more than one thing in them for the benefit of the community. We do have them in New Brunswick. I have heard of them, but they're quite few and far between.
They are like the one at St. Joseph's Hospital that was started by the Brewers,
right,
who are husband and wife doctor, is really quite unique. What you mostly see are kind of combined practices, like you might have 6 doctors who share a clinic space, but they're still they're a private corporation.
Right.
They're not a publicly funded community health center, which is what I'm envisioning here.
Okay. No, that's good. That really answers the question. I thank you for that. Okay, so the last one, I shouldn't say the last one, because there's other questions that we can get to. It's always one of those things where you get questions from the audience, and if you get to them, great. If you can't, well, we had the main one. So, but the last one on my main list is the climate change question, and I just kind of said it this way. Climate change it's top of mind for almost all Canadians. The only party that doesn't have any platform to mention of it, to my knowledge, is the People's Party, and I shouldn't disqualify them so harshly. They mention climate change, but they mention it in a sense that, well, we should protect forests and the environment, but we don't really have to go too far out of our way to protect or to reduce all these things that are good for our economy. So anyway, I won't go too far down that hole, but almost everybody agrees that we need to tackle climate change. But many Canadians are patiently waiting for the government to lead us into a more ambitious plan to to reduce emissions and create more local sustainability. So I know the Greens have in their platform a 60% reduction. It's the most ambitious target. How do we get there? What are the implications for St. John? What would we see happen if the Green Party were to push these reforms?
Okay. Well, what we would see the funding that is currently the federal funding that is currently being put into nuclear projects, which are a dead end, being diverted into renewable energy efficiency storage, and grid interconnections. These reactors, for example, which the federal government is funding,
You mean the small modular
the
reactors?
small modular nuclear reactors and the waste reprocessing unit that is proposed, that are receiving federal funds. It's the waste processing unit actually that's receiving federal funds. The ARC nuclear reactor has received provincial funds.
Yes.
But these things, if they're even doable, are, well, they're still only computer designs. So if they are commercial, if they can be built, which is a big if because they never have been, it won't be till the early to mid 2030s. And that is too late for us to avoid the worst effects of climate change. So they fail on time. They fail on cost because they will be prohibitively expensive to build. In 2016, the Moltec CEO in the UK said that his project, his reactor and his waste reprocessor, would cost $2 billion to build. That was in 2016.
Wow.
Nuclear projects have historically been plagued by budget overruns and time delays. And the first and the Point Lepreau reactor was no exception.
Yes.
It was 10 years building. In other words, it was 3 times late, and it was about 3 times the cost. It was budgeted at around 480 million and ended up being 1.5, 1.2, no, 1 billion. So a huge cost overrun. This is typical for nuclear projects, large and small, and and there's no indication that small modular reactors will be any different. Therefore, rather than pouring money down something that is going to be prohibitively expensive, very dangerous in terms of the radioactive waste, is also dangerous in terms of encouraging nuclear proliferation. I, as a Green MP, would fight tooth and nail to divert that money into erecting windmills and solar installations and some geothermal. These are mature technologies. Wind and solar are a heck of a lot cheaper. They are readily available. They can start reducing emissions in 1 or 2 building seasons, as opposed to 15 years down the road, and maybe they won't even work. I mean, it's it's just, to me, crazy to consider these things. But I think they're being considered and being pushed because in the province, the federal government is willing to fund them. So the province sees a source of funding. So therefore, they want to, capitalize on that source of funding. But it is economically, it's, even if you don't care about the environment or about human health, economically, the case is just not there.
Well, I've
it's
heard
the most expensive electricity on the grid.
Yeah, I've heard a couple of things on this topic. I've heard basically one of Canada's leading experts around nuclear energy say these are nothing but paper reactors, and we have never seen one built. And even if we did build one and somebody knocked it out of the park and became the Elon Musk of small modular nuclear reactors, you're still 10 years of scale up, and then you're still 10 years of distribution. So I found that to be the most compelling argument. He was an International Atomic Energy Association, specialist. He had done all this work, and it was right on the CBC and said, look, these small modular nuclear reactors are not the saving thing. But we have a province and we have NB Power who are determined to play venture capitalism with taxpayers' money on risky investments. So I certainly agree. That is not where we should be spending our money. So you're saying let's constrain those investments.
Let's turn them off.
Right. Let's
turn off. Let's cease all federal funding for new nuclear development.
Right. And so then I've had this question put back to me. How then do we balance the grid? So what I've heard in defense of nuclear energy is that unless you have something that can put out a lot of a large amount of consistent energy, you have a very difficult task on a provincial scale to balance the grid for energy consumption. And like the best example we have is places in the world that have literally built hydro dams that suck water uphill when energy is everywhere, when they have their windmills producing a lot and their solar energy is producing a lot, and they can turn on these pumps because they have extra energy to suck water uphill, capture that energy when the sun's not doing so good and the wind isn't doing so good and the geothermal is not doing so good, to let that water come down through turbines to produce hydroelectricity. But I that's where I get lost, as to how, if we don't have something that can produce big amounts of energy like nuclear, what do we do? How do we balance that grid? And that's, I guess, if there was one thing I see missing from everybody's platform, it's what do we do without nuclear? I agree that the venture piece is wrong, but what do we do without nuclear if we're not going to go down that way?
Okay, so here's my thought. The first thing to do is to reduce energy consumption. And that can be done through energy efficiency measures and a nationwide retrofit program of every building in the country.
Right.
Once again, people say, well, that will cost an arm and a leg. But I say, yes, it's an investment, but it puts people to work in communities. Once again, you have the money being spent in the communities. You have the people paying taxes. You have the people paying rent. You have them buying houses. So it becomes it's not just money being thrown down a hole. It becomes money that goes to work. So at the same time, we must bring our energy consumption down. We simply have to do it, because you're right. Renewable energy on its own is not enough.
Right.
So lower the consumption. The next piece is storage. Now, storage technologies are already 10 years ahead of small modular nuclear reactors in terms of their development.
Yep, that's true.
Think of where they'll be in another 10 years' time. What really boggles me is, if New Brunswick wants to be a leader, like they always talk about being a leader in nuclear technology, why don't they become a leader in storage technology?
Right.
Canada already has a company called HydroStore that does compressed air storage in salt formations. So there's an example of a company. There also there's a community out in Alberta in Okotoks called Drake Landing Thermal. It's a solar thermal community. Right. And what they do is they harvest solar energy, far more than they need in the summer, and they store it underground in thermal units. Basically, it's thermal mass, so it's probably stored in something like concrete or sand or some such thing.
It's heat. Yep.
And they draw on it all winter, and they're completely off grid. They supply entirely their own energy. So you see, we have to get away from thinking that we need a huge centralized power source that pumps out large amounts of power constantly, and think of decentralized multiple sources of power that are integrated by a smart grid and interconnected around this region and also across the country. We need a pan-Canadian grid so that we are feeding energy into it from distributed sources of all kinds from all over the nation, so that if the sun isn't shining in St. John, it's probably shining in Edmonton, Alberta, and they're contributing energy to the grid that then we can draw on. New Brunswick also has tremendous potential for pumped water storage, because we have a lot of little abandoned dams sitting around that are not being used, because NB Power decided back in the 1970s that it would become a nuclear utility. They made that decision back then. So consequently, they abandoned these dams, like the Musquash Dam, for example.
Or the St. George Dam, where I'm from.
Yeah, the St. George Dam was bought by the Irvings, who have upgraded it from 1 megawatt to 3 megawatts.
Yeah.
And so it's a productive little unit.
Hmm.
So, I mean, but, rehabilitating these dams for pumped water storage would
Mm.
be something that, the roads are already in there, the power lines are in there,
Yeah.
the buildings are there, the machinery, the turbines are toast. I mean, and they're out of date. They'd all have to be ripped out. But I
Sure.
mean, using that infrastructure, doing probably some necessary structural repairs just because of wear and tear, and using them for pumped water storage, to me, would be an excellent use of. It's a renovation,
Yeah.
dear to every housing person's heart.
Yeah. 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 It's a good point, and I can see. Well, I mean, I can see that you really have a strong understanding on that file, on how you approach that, and part of me says, you know what, we need you on the St. John Energy Utility Board, because this is what we hear from our own utility here in St. John. They've won an award on a number of files. They've won an international recognition award for their smart grid work. They've won an international award for their deployment around Birch Hill, and they continue to go challenged by our own New Brunswick utility, which most people don't know. But it comes to a philosophical difference, and like you hit it. The philosophical difference is this: NB Power thinks the only solution is big power blocks that produce power all the time, that can just easily balance the grid whenever they want. St. John Energy type individuals, or like I'm hearing you talk about with the Green Party, believe that the only way, or the best way, that we can achieve energy independence is by decentralizing the energy production game, getting as many people into it as possible, with as many technologies as possible, and rewarding them to do so that you have a million little sources of energy rather than just 500 really big ones. And if I were to pick one, it would be that, for sure, because we're seeing people here in St. John who are experts in their industry, and they're just leading interesting little initiatives that are having big impacts around the world of energy. So yeah, it's encouraging, but it's a challenge too, because you have those two competing philosophies, and we don't talk about it enough as a public. But it's it's important. All right, well, that brings us to the end of our main question segment. I've asked a couple of little questions along the way that I've had from just people. I've just kind of put them in there. Like I said, with Sierra, she had a question. We're just about out of time here. We're down to the last really minute and a half. Is there anything you want to say just before we wrap up, that just to the people of St. John Rothsay? Obviously, Annamie Paul had a great showing last night in the federal leaders debate. She really surprised people. She came across as the most disciplined, I would say, and she came across as somebody who's willing to collaborate, regardless of what it costs. If it costs a few seats, fine. We still need to collaborate. We need to come together and solve this climate crisis. We need to solve injustices around racial discrimination and whatever. So I think Annamie Paul, the leader of the Canadian Greens, presented that. But what do you think? Is there any last words, I guess, from your position as the Canadian Greens candidate for St. John?
I really think that St. John and the St. John Rothsay can participate meaningfully and productively in making a just transition, a transition that leaves no citizen and no worker behind, to a renewable energy economy based on renewable energy, efficiency, storage, and grid interconnections. I believe that we can do that and have a socially just society where people are given the security of a guaranteed livable income, affordable housing, universal pharmacare, universal child care and universal dental care so that their basic needs are provided for, and so that the stress of that some people are living with not knowing where their next meal is coming from, not wondering if they're going to have a roof over their head the next day. So that stress is removed from their lives, and so that their human potential is unlocked. And I believe it is possible. And I believe it is possible too with the very wealthy paying their fair share. I support a wealth tax of 1% on family net income that is 20 million or over. That's easily affordable for somebody earning that kind of money. I support ending subsidies to fossil fuel pipelines and the nuclear industry. Fossil fuel subsidies alone by the Liberal government, which pledged to reduce them, were 900 million last year during a pandemic year. And our emissions went up during a pandemic year when we had reduced economic and personal activity. So there are ways to redirect this money and put it towards a transition that will ensure us a livable future and ensure our children's children a livable future, but will also create economic activity and prosperity in areas that are right now completely left fallow. So that is what I pledge as a Green MP. I will fight as a Green MP with every ounce of passion and my energy to bring this about.
Mm-hmm. Well, Anne, I really want to thank you for that. It was a pleasure to interview and chat about some of these issues. And clearly, you have a lot of passion. You have a lot of enthusiasm for this platform, and you really brought it home well for us to see what it would mean for the implications of New Brunswick, what it would mean for implications of St. John and Rothesay. So yeah, I wish you the best of luck. We're up to just over an hour here now. So we've had over a dozen people at any one time here, just tracking along with between Facebook and Twitter and YouTube and the platforms we share on. So this will just be shareable for people. Like if you want to go to my counselor page or my personal Twitter or my counselor YouTube, you can find all of those. It's just under Brent 4SJ, so it's BRENT number 4SJ, and share these. They'll be up and ready to share. But yeah, again, thank you so much for the time this evening.
Thank you, Brent.
No problem. Have a good night.
You too. Bye-bye.